Welcome to the Initiative Clima Internacional, or the ICI, and Baringa Partners-led webinar series on decarbonizing Scope 3 emissions. This is the final of the four-part series on Scope 3 engagement, or achieving Scope 3 targets through engagement, geared really towards private equity-backed companies, portfolio companies. I'm Nandini Hampel from Brigal Investments and co-lead with Thomas Carlier here on the right-hand side of the slide at Invest Industrial of the ICI grouping, led Scope 3 Decarbonisation Working Group, really in collaboration with several other private markets firms, which we'll introduce to you in just a minute. The experts really at Baringa Partners will lead us through the discussion today, alongside a few case studies from industry experts here. You have Oliver Hurry and Louise Rubinder. To briefly introduce the session, essentially to decarbonize the global economy, there's an urgent need for all actors in the real economy to reduce their GHG emissions at a sufficient rate to remain aligned with the emissions pathways established by climate science. Scope 3 emissions, or value chain related emissions, are 11.4 times higher than direct operational emissions. And throughout the webinar series, which have been recorded and this one will also be recorded, we've heard from private market leads and companies about Scope 3 emissions. What are they? How and what data should be collected to estimate your emissions, and the value of engaging with your value chain partners to reduce those emissions overall and activate wide-scale decarbonization efforts. Just a few words on ICI before I pass it on to Evan at Baringa Partners. So ICI is a global practitioner-led community of private equity firms, private markets firms, and investors that seek to better understand and manage the risks associated with climate change. We're 236 members, 236 plus members to date, representing a combined $3 trillion in AUM. And the ICI Scope 3 Decarbonization Group is one of many groups with a dozen PE firms in partnership with the PRI, or the Principles for Responsible Investment. With that, happy to turn it over to Evan at Baringa. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So just going to the next slide. So just a quick introduction to us at Baringa. So we're a global management consultancy. We work across the UK, Europe, North America, Asia, Australia, with 2,000 people, all working really closely with our clients, and we really specialize in energy, sustainability, global transition. So we're helping our clients grapple with those really deep questions, both from a financial services side and really working with individual companies as they develop their transition strategies, thinking about what does decarbonization mean for them. We're also a B Corp, so we live and breathe our values, and this is something that we as a business are really passionate about. We're going on to the next slide. For those of you who hopefully you've attended all of our other webinars. If you've not, they're all available on YouTube or through our website. We started off on a bit of a journey going through this series of webinars with the ICI. The first we started with talking about what are Scope 3 emissions. Moved on to, once you know what they are, how do you start to collect those that data that you need? When you've got the data, how do you set a target? And today, we're really focusing on how do you achieve a target? How do you really reduce your Scope 3 emissions? So going on to the next slide, our plan for today, we'll do a quick recap of what we've discussed, some of the key topics from the other three webinars. Then we're going to pass over to Oliver, who's going to talk about specifically thinking about what do we do with engaging with our clients, with our customers, suppliers on their Scope 3 emissions. And then Louise is going to take us through a case study, lessons learned, 6 really good action steps that she took from working with Ericsson when they were decarbonizing. And finally, we'll have some questions at the end. So please, to go through, put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll be really happy to engage and answer your questions as best we can. Going on to the next slide, the next one after this is thinking a little bit about what are Scope 3 emissions. Just a quick reminder. There are 15 different categories of Scope 3 emissions. This is describing the emissions that come from your value chain, so not the emissions that you're necessarily producing as a business, but what are the emissions involved in the overall value chain. This is divided up into your upstream emissions and your downstream emissions. You'll have different relevancies, different materiality for these types of emissions based on your business. we commonly see that the biggest areas are category 1, so purchase goods and services. These are the things that you're buying from your supply chain that contribute to your emissions from your value chain. And also the category 11, use of products sold. This is how are the things that you're making, what is the carbon that they're putting into the air? So you see at the bottom, there's lots of different mix of different materiality for your businesses, but ultimately, this is all about talking about how do you engage with that value chain in different ways to have the biggest impact on your overall Scope 3 portfolio. So going on to the next slide, we talked a little bit about how do you start to quantify the problem. So what are the steps that you would go through in order to understand what your Scope 3 emissions are? So the first step that we recommended, that we talked about from the GHG protocol, is around prioritizing how you're collecting data. So this is looking at what are your key activities that are causing your emissions. How do you look at what you're doing from a materiality perspective? So that might be how much you're spending or how much of your revenue coming from those types of emissions. And then looking at kind of some of those key activities, looking at sort of risk exposure or sector-specific guidance that's the most relevant for your business. Once you've understood sort of how you're going to prioritize it, you then go into selecting the data that you want to use. So this is around, so what are your business goals? Why are you trying to do decarbonization? Why are you thinking about your Scope 3? So a lot of that can impact the way that you decide to go about reducing your Scope 3 emissions. Once you've chosen the data that you want to select, then moving into how you're actually going to collect that. And we talked a lot about tier 1 versus tier 2. How are you looking at your proxies? What's the real data that you're able to get from your suppliers? We found that with lots of our clients, this is the really detailed, difficult bit to get, which isn't a surprise. Scope 3 emissions are new for everyone, which is why the last step is all about how do you start to improve your data over time. One of the things we talked about before was not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, and that it's important to make baby steps. And even if it means that you're proxying lots of your Scope 3 emissions to start with, good to do that and then try to improve it over time rather than just wait until the very end and try and when it's perfect, better to start with something, even if it's proxies. Going on to the next slide, this was our last webinar. We started to talk about setting different emission reduction targets for your Scope 3. This framework comes from the SBTI. It's a really useful way to think about how you can set targets. The SBTI recommends 4 different types of targets. So there's an absolute reduction target for your Scope 3, looking at absolute, how can you reduce your emissions year on year. The next is a sector decarbonization. So this would be relevant for when you've got particular areas within your emissions that are coming from major sectors. So for example, if steel is a really important contributor to your overall emissions, you might look to set a specific decarbonization target that's just around steel. The challenge with that, of course, is that over time, you might want to move away from steel. You might want to find other alternatives. So you can have some challenges around sector decarbonization. The next area is around looking at your physical or economic intensity. So these are ways that you can set your targets based on some unit of output. That might be per shoe that you produce, if you're a business that makes shoes. It might also be around your economic intensity. And finally, the last area that you can use to set targets is around supplier or customer engagement. These are specific targets around how you're engaging with your customers and suppliers and encouraging them to set Scope 1 and 2 emission reduction targets for themselves. But it's a little bit misleading to think that there's just one category that's engagement, because in order to do any of these types of targets, it's really important that you're engaging with your suppliers and your customers in order to have real decarbonization, which is what the topic is for today. And so with that, I will pass over to Oliver, who's going to start talking about how are we going to think about decarbonization? What are some of the practical tools that you can use to address your Scope 3? And again, if you get any questions as you go through, please do pop them in the Q&A chat. We'll be happy to take them up at the end.
Lovely. Thank you, Evan. Hopefully everyone can hear me and you can see my screen. But delighted to be joined by you today. My name is Oliver Hurry. I've spent about 19, nearly 20 years working on sustainable supply chains, mainly getting people together who have very complex problems when it comes to sustainability, have no idea what it's all about, and are trying to solve them together. So lots of crying on each other's shoulder. Scope 3 pretty much has dominated that work for those last 2 decades. And I have to say, quite flippantly, no one really knows much better now about what to do on Scope 3 than they did 20 years ago. I'm fairly flippant on that, but obviously a lot of great work's been done, but it is an incredibly complex challenge. It's also an incredibly urgent one. It's one that we needed to have tackled a long time ago. And fortunately, amongst all the guidance and the jargon and everything else that's in there, there is some really practical stuff. So hopefully I'm going to share a little bit today with you about what the companies in the world are doing, what actions and tools are being used. I've written these slides very much as a toolkit, so you will get these slides afterwards. You'll be able to click on the links and hopefully be able to dive into it a lot more yourself. I wear a number of hats, but one of the big hats that I wear at the moment, in fact, 2 big hats that I wear, is one is I lead a thing called the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is a global non-profit trying to help procurement professionals translate and understand sustainability in Scope 3 for procurement professionals. Free resources available for all industries, all countries, all available online. I'll share a little bit more about that in a second. But for the purposes of this session, my role as chair and founder of the Scope 3 peer group is probably most relevant. So for 4 years, a group of what is now nearly 1,200 people working on Scope 3 in all sorts of sizes of companies has been meeting every 2 to 3 months and almost literally crying on each other's shoulder about how difficult it is to engage leadership, to engage suppliers, to collect data, and just navigate the noise of everything that's out there. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today isn't from the mouth of a Scope 3 expert. I certainly never claim to be, and there are plenty of other people on this call who can fill that shoes. But certainly I've been monitoring and tracking what companies are actually doing and what progress they're actually making or attempting to make. And so hopefully I'll share a little bit of that too today. And most importantly, give you all of hopefully the places that you should be going to look and finding other stuff. So first 3 points that aren't necessarily the best practices around supplier engagement, but they're things that often get forgotten, things that perhaps companies have had to realize the hard way. The first one, which I think is very much happening today to a certain extent, is there's a big difference between supplier communication or stakeholder communication, supplier engagement or supplier collaboration. Collaboration is a word that's massively overused. And I think it's really important to understand that when you're engaging your customers, your suppliers, any stakeholder really on anything, if you're talking about supplier communication, that's what most people do. They talk at their suppliers or at their portfolio or at their customers. It's very much a one-way communication. It's very much, we want you to do this, give us this data, etc., etc. It's been pretty much shown over the last few decades that asking your suppliers to do this and not have slaves in your supply chain and not have too high carbon emissions, frankly, that doesn't really drive a huge amount of change. It just drives a lot of frustration because suppliers mainly just don't know what these things are, let alone how to manage them, and certainly haven't got necessarily the resources to do so. Supplier engagement is also a phrase that you hear a lot, which again, in my world means that you're talking with your suppliers and your customers. That means you've got a dialogue, there's a conversation happening. You're actually meeting with them, maybe virtually at scale, but you're actually hearing from them and listening to them. Supplier collaboration really is taking action with your suppliers. So what does that actually mean? That means not just asking them for data or telling them what they should be thinking. It means not just having a conversation about what they're up to and what their needs are, and again, usually coming to a conclusion that something needs to happen. It's actually working with them to unlock the barriers. And the key barriers to suppliers or anyone doing anything on carbon is usually they don't know what it is. Carbon and Scope 3 can be very confusing. They don't know who to do it with, and they haven't got any particular skills in-house to do it necessarily, especially smaller companies, and they quite often haven't got the resources or the money to do it. So where does the responsibility lie for Scope 3 emissions to be reduced? A very good argument. I think it's everyone's responsibility, and through collaboration with your suppliers, encouraging them, giving them ideas, encouraging innovation back, encouraging ideas for reductions back. That's what supplier collaboration is. And really procurement and companies should be doing that all day, every day, spending more time with their suppliers, appreciating that they can't do that with everyone, but there are more and more tools that allow that to do that. One of my favorite images over the last 20 years is that one of weighing the pig. So slightly outdated analogy, but the reality is in supply chains, you don't fatten pigs by weighing them. You don't fatten suppliers. You don't help suppliers by just asking them for data. Hopefully one day companies will realize that. So it is absolutely critical that you talk with your suppliers throughout and you don't just ask them for data. Again, I found it interesting, and I don't think it's on purpose, that supplier engagement is the last step in this conversation about Scope 3. And in this webinar series as well. Supplier engagement happens absolutely at the start and throughout. You will not know what targets to set. You will not know what's practically possible. You will not get any data. You will not even know which platform to choose properly to collect that data if you don't talk to your suppliers and have a conversation with them at the very start. It should never come at the very end. So supplier engagement absolutely is critical. That's something that I see throughout the best practice. Is the more engaged your suppliers are, the more data you'll get, the more savings and impact you get, the more innovation you'll get as a business, and so on. And finally, Louise, again, we'll touch upon this, I'm sure, as a best practice, and I'll explain a little bit more, but you can't choose one approach for all of your suppliers. You need to segment your suppliers and choose the right strategy, the right tactic, the right engagement methods for each of those. And there are so many ways you could segment your suppliers, and I encourage you to think about them in a number of different ways. Most companies segment their suppliers by spend. That's a pretty terrible way to segment suppliers, in my opinion, on a number of reasons. There are very small suppliers that you will not spend a lot of money with who could have some amazing ideas to reduce your carbon footprint. So again, size isn't everything. Maturity is an interesting one. Understanding the maturity of your suppliers, obviously asking if they set science-based targets is one way of doing that, but really understanding, do they have the capability? Do they have dedicated people focusing on carbon? These are the sorts of questions you can ask. How much leverage you have over them. If you're a company that buys a lot of services and tech, you might find yourself very frustrated that you don't have a lot of leverage over your suppliers. How much impact can those suppliers have? If they're big manufacturing, aluminium, steel, glass suppliers, they're going to have a big impact. How strong is your relationship? That's not just how long is the contract. How strong is the relationship? You might be having a really bad time with that supplier, and they may be billed as a strategic supplier. So looking at things through a number of lenses, and then ultimately deciding what the best approach is for those suppliers, what tools, what engagement, tactics, and so on. So one other way to look at it is that suppliers need a range of support and tools to take action. So unless you're looking at this map and thinking about practically how you might be able to, even if it's just pointing them somewhere, they might be able to get this support, then you really won't drive action. Obviously, there are going to be lots of companies who are just flat out small, business, busy, whatever, and just don't really understand the importance of this to them. So you're going to have to do a bit of education, a bit like we're doing today. But even if they know that they need to do something, most people are really struggling with the jargon and everything else. You're going to need to engage them and help them, engage them with content. Of course, they're going to need tools. They really need tools. There's so many resources out there, which I'm going to share with you in a second. So there's plenty of opportunity to help people, point people towards free tools that are available in the world today for them to use. The importance of collaboration, again, it's a word that's overused, but frankly, helping your suppliers to help each other, helping them realize they've probably got to collaborate with their suppliers. They've got to collaborate sometimes with their peers. A lot of collaboration is required with competitors to tackle Scope 3. If you're not collaborating with your peers or your competitors on Scope 3 at some level, even if it's just understanding what they're doing, you're not doing it properly. Finally, of course, there's no point talking about all of this and laying it all out if you can't help companies justify, maybe that's a bit of a defensive word, but certainly important to justify the case for action on carbon reduction. And finally, you've got to be able to help them instigate projects. Now, again, not saying you have to work with all those suppliers, not saying you have to create those projects, but even if it's just pointing them in the direction of opportunities to make those reductions, it's really important that someone, certainly not no one, takes responsibility for all of this, all of these steps. So here's my toolkit. I'll talk a little bit through some of these, but I'm basically going to give this to you, and you guys can use these links and hopefully dive into them to get everything you need. It may be a bit of an overload, but hopefully some of this kind of makes sense. One best practice that I would highlight is the work that Mars do. And this is a best practice more broadly about supplier engagement on sustainability, not necessarily carbon. But what they've done is they've looked at their supply chain, they've segmented them and understood that at different types of suppliers, different sizes of suppliers, different numbers of suppliers, you need different tactics. For a lot of their suppliers, they just look at a code of conduct. And as they get more and more up the chain with key suppliers, prioritized suppliers in high-risk locations or high-risk or high-carbon impacts, they spend more time with them. Again, not exactly rocket science, but I definitely highlight Mars's program and the way that they've segmented their suppliers on human rights and carbon and others as a great example. I put a couple of links in here from spp.earth, which is the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. There's a few videos in there. Another really good case study I would recommend, and again, they may be a big company, but the philosophy is the most important thing, is the work that Philips do and have done for many years. And again, this applies to carbon and human rights and everything else. The future of supply chain sustainability is working with your suppliers to find problems, rather than asking your suppliers to give you data that hopefully reports no problems. There's a big difference. So Philips fundamentally tried to reward their suppliers for finding human rights challenges, carbon reduction opportunities. So the future I very clearly see from a lot of best practice is actually rewarding and encouraging your suppliers to find problems, rather than, as I said, trying to get that data back that tells you there's nothing wrong. Because guess what? There's plenty wrong. In carbon, there's always carbon to be saved. And if you think there's no slaves in your supply chain, you're significantly forgotten. There are plenty of slaves in your supply chain, whether it's in the Western world or whatever it may be. You think you're okay. There's plenty going on you need to find. I'm sure many of you are aware of the CDP. There's a fantastic number of reports. There's Supplier Engagement Leader Program, and Leaderboard is a really good indication of some of the leaders in supplier engagement, and their research is really good. And one of their reports a few years ago highlighted that key challenge, that suppliers do not make improvements unless they have the capability, the capacity, and the money. Unless you help them, or at least point them towards resources to understand what to do, how to do it, who to do it with, and how to afford it, nothing will ever really improve. Just going to finish off with a few more points. So again, plenty of knowledge out there that's free. Some of you may know about the SME Climate Hub. It's improving. Certainly I was involved in the development of that over the last few years. It's again a free resource for all SMEs in the world to find all the right tools, all the right knowledge, all the right best practice, and actually share ideas with other SMEs. It is all free and available to be used. Oxford have created a net zero tools list in there, and there's plenty of wonderful resources. It's also worth checking out the World Business Council Development's new Climate Drive platform, which again is trying to help best practice benchmarking. Another great place to look for resources, again in a similar kind of vibe to the SME Climate Hub. It's information collated and put in there, again, to almost get rid of all of those excuses about there being too confusing content out there all over the place. I would also highlight again the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. If you go to spp.earth, you can find a category called Supplier Engagement, and it's got best practice guidance and videos and YouTube videos. I've even done a Supplier Engagement Toolkit webinar in there highlighting a lot of these tools and some others, so highly recommend that as well. Final quick couple. So highly recommend a report that came out 2021, I think it was, by the WBCSD, World Business Council Sustainable Development. Lots of acronyms in these initiatives, and PwC, which looked at the incentivization of suppliers for decarbonisation. In fact, one of their really good reports, I'll put it up on the screen now, shows a really interesting matrix to help you understand the different methods by which you can incentivize suppliers. So looking at leveraging and enforcing financial and non-financial rewards and penalties and rewards. And it gives you a really good indication about the various different methods that you can use to support and encourage, and in some cases use carrot and stick to engage your suppliers to drive action. There is a really good report and tool about that I can share with you here. Bear with me. Which is the SBTi's new guide. This came out in the last week or so. It shows exactly how best practice on supplier engagement for decarbonisation runs. It's got a really good step-by-step guide, although I'd say always with step-by-step guides, often the supplier engagement comes as a moment in time rather than actually a thing that should happen all of the time. But this guide is only a week old. Highly, highly recommend to take a look at that. Going back to some resources. As part of the Scope 3 peer group, the Scope 3 peer group is a collaboration of peers. It's free to participate. You have to be someone who's actually working on Scope 3 in a company, obviously, naturally. We meet every 2 to 3 months. It really is an informal opportunity to really understand what people are actually doing in jobs with a very tricky challenge. So you're more than welcome to participate in that. You can take the free Scope 3 maturity benchmark, which will give you an indication of actually how well your progress is, even if you're at the start on Scope 3, but more importantly, tell you the actual things that actual companies have done across supplier engagement, procurement engagement, data methodology. So it's almost like a best practice library in that. You're very, very welcome to participate in that. And in fact, we're having our first meeting in London, which is a giant workshop and therapy session on the Scope 3, and everybody's invited to that on the 24th. You would also highly recommend the Climate Fit training that's in the SME Climate Hub. Again, that's a really good training for SMEs on net zero. We highly recommend that. Supplierday.com are a fantastic group of individuals who run supplier engagement days. Again, if you're looking to run engagement days with your supply chain and really educate them and support them, they're a really good resource. And finally, a fantastic resource called the Chancery Lane Project. If you haven't come across that, I highly recommend it. 700 lawyers got together and provided, it's literally the contract clauses you can put in your contracts, cut and paste them from the internet, put them into your contracts and send them to your suppliers. It's not always as easy as that, but ultimately it is as simple as that sounds. You can literally download them for free. They're credible, they're quality, and you can insert them into your contracts and engage your procurement team on that. I think that's enough from me. I think you should probably hear more from Louise. Happy to take questions later on as well. I'll have a little look, as I said, there is any, and I'll hopefully be able to answer those too. But hopefully that's useful. And indeed, back to the team. And of course, you will get all of these slides very shortly as well. Louise, over to you.
All right, thank you. So Evan, you didn't want to take any questions now for Oliver? Or do we do that at the very end?
Yes. So it looks like we just had one question coming through that's about sharing a list of tools, and so yeah, absolutely we'll send out this deck with all those links. Yep. So no worries there. But yeah, just keep your questions coming through, and then we'll answer as well. But yeah, over to you, Louise.
Right, thank you very much. And yes, I'm very excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is supplier engagement. But now Oliver was bringing up that communication, engagement and collaboration. So where are we? I think we're somewhere in between engagement and collaboration in what I will be talking about. But I will be talking about this kind of very basics, taking you back to how you start with supplier engagement and supplier climate action then. And Oliver didn't bring it up, but it was on his slide, a guide, supplier engagement guide, and I will be talking about this this guide and the content of that, how we've narrowed it down to kind of very, very basic steps. So I was working at Ericsson, which Evan mentioned, so I'll be taking a few examples from there, and probably I will say we for both Ericsson and where I work now, and that's the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So don't be confused there. This is my company now. And Exponential Roadmap Initiative, it's an organization. We're collecting kind of innovators, transformers, disruptors, companies and organizations that are really creative, working with the question of climate action. We have about, in the next slide, you can see our members, about 60-ish members and partners that we're working with, big companies, small companies, but you have to be very ambitious. You have to be in the forefront working with this, or having the ambition of being there in the forefront working with climate action. And we're actually checking that with our companies too, making sure that they're following the criteria of Race to Zero, the UN-backed initiative. But what we do also is that we collaborate. We, in this initiative, we collaborate, making sure that we're finding these best practices and we're spreading them, and we hope then for some exponential effect to these best practices. And I will be talking about one best practice in this session. And go to the next slide, you can see the supplier action guide. And that is where we have summarized one practice of how you can engage your suppliers. And this very practice is about taking this, the responsibility of setting a climate target, taking that with your suppliers. And you can also take it with your customers and peers and partners and competitors too, of course, everyone in your circuit. But making sure that the responsibility is not only with you, but that you spread that sense also to others, making sure that you have kind of a collaborative start on climate action, making sure that you're going in the same direction. Because as you see, when you are working with different companies, sometimes the direction is not always there. There may be some direction, but it's not the 1.5 degree or halving to 2030. So maybe we need to kind of focus that as well. All action is good, but sometimes we need to kind of shape it up a little bit. And what you see in the next slide is kind of the effect that we want to see. It's, of course, this kind of party effect where we have a lot of parties starting at the same time. Your customers, suppliers, peers and partners, and all those stakeholders that you have. If we start at the same time, it will be easier. The dialogue will be easier, the innovation will be more creative, you'll collaborate in a better way, and you have a better language to use when you talk about where you want to go and where you want to see those reductions of emissions. So when I talk about cascading the message, this is kind of what I'm talking about, and the halving by 2030. All right, so we'll get into it. Narrowing it down to the very, very, very most basic steps when it comes to opening up climate action with your supply chain, it could be those. So we've narrowed down to a few simple steps from this supplier action guide, and you'll have the link in this presentation when you get it. And it's about, sorry, there are some insects here. I'm sitting in the meadow. It is about kind of getting started and finding a focus. That's how I find it. I will go through management, approval and blessing and the importance of that and assigning a person responsible. And that's kind of how you get the focus on this activity. Then designing the message to suppliers. And luckily, and as Oliver says, a lot of companies are already working with this. So messages are already there. So kind of a copy-paste opportunity. Selecting suppliers to work with, that is often where a lot of companies and people kind of stop because, we have 10,000 suppliers in the supply chain, where to start? Oliver gave you a first few hints of that, and I'll go through that also in a little bit more detail. Then communicate to selected suppliers. Have you done 1 to 4? Then that would be fairly simple. And then also the following up. It's not communication to your suppliers, do this, do that. You also need to have a dialogue. Otherwise, little will happen if you just put it in the code of conduct, which you should also do, of course, but only that will not be enough in order to get the action that you want to have. So we'll get to the next slide, and we go to this management, approval and blessing. So this may not be the first step. It could be one of the first steps, but at some point in time, you will want to have the management on your side. Preferably higher staff management, but also maybe head of procurement and head of sustainability, all of those. But maybe you would want to get head of R&D on your side. There, you need to look around a little bit to see who you want to have on board, but also just seeing who you want to start with to get that action going. At Ericsson, we did start a little bit with the plotting and scheming, creating a plan of what we wanted to do before we actually went to the highest up management, and we got Börje on board. That was is the CEO of Ericsson. So we did a plan of what we wanted to do, kind of what target, more or less what suppliers to work with and so on. And then we went, this is what we want to do. And one of the managers there was very enthusiastic and upped the target even sharper. So we got to work even harder with it, but that was good. So then we could always have or think of having them in our back, like, okay, they're supporting this, they're checking on this. making it so much easier. So make sure you have the approval and blessing of your management. If you are one of those that are approving or blessing, then this is a quite simple step, I think. Otherwise, please try to get it as soon as you can. And we go to number 2, and that's assigning a person responsible. And I realize that many of you will already have started with this, and this is old news, but it is so important. And maybe you need, it's always good with a reminder. I was a responsible person. I was a driver working with a Supplier Climate Action Program at Ericsson. It was super interesting and a lot of fun. So lucky the person being the assigned responsible for this activity. But these two, the 1 and 2, creates focus. You have someone who's driving that is doing the reporting to someone who is interested to see that report. So this creates focus. Of course, a lot of people will be involved in this activity, and having been in procurement for 4 years, make sure you involve the people who are responsible for the suppliers. Of course, you don't step around those that are responsible for supplier 1, 2, 3, and 35, and so on. You need to have them aboard, because maybe some supplier you're not going to work with them anymore, or you're having a serious kind of negotiation with another. So keep them on board. And let's step 2, number 3, and that is you have blessing and approval. You have someone who's driving this, and you need to have a message, the kind of content that you want to give out to your supplier. What are you asking for? What is the kind of action that you want to see? And now I'm thinking of the kind of language that you want to use. And a lot of it you may also be found in Oliver's different tools that he showed you. You want to align with a language that is kind of seen as the standard. So that may be the 1.5 degree ambition, obviously, and or maybe the halving to 2030. You want to know what the scope 1, 2, 3 is, and so on. But also, what are you asking suppliers to do, and by what time, and also what support are you going to give your suppliers? But yes, they will need support for this. It's not super easy, this. You need to have it as structured as possible. And this message is supposed to make it structured, because this has already been used by a lot of different companies. We used it with Ericsson. I know several other companies that have been using it some time ago, and also very recently. So this is very much up to date. And what you see here, dear supplier, etc., that you can find in this guide that I showed you in the previous slide, the supplier action guide. A great copy-paste opportunity, making it easier to get started quickly. So moving on to number 4, selecting suppliers to work with. And have you ever painted a wall in a house, or painted a house, and you go into the color shop and you see all these little tablets with different colors? There is like 1 million. And that is kind of the sensation I hear when you start looking at your supply chain, because it may be 50,000 suppliers, it may be 1,000 suppliers, but often it's a little bit of that. How do we start? And selecting a manageable amount of suppliers, that's what I write there on the side. And manageable is kind of a keyword here, because you don't want to start with too much, because hopefully you'll get replies from suppliers, and you don't want to get replies from 50,000 suppliers unless you have this super cool AI tool that would sort everything out for you. But that does not exist yet. If you have, like we did at Ericsson, we had at the time about 20,000 suppliers. We started with 80. That we thought was a manageable amount based on how we were sorting out and categorizing our suppliers. You may start with less, or you may start with more, but think about that. If you give me one more click. We have in this guide, we have 6 different categories that you can look at, or not categories, but factors you can use when sorting out what suppliers to work with. Spend was one thing that Oliver mentioned. I think we have different perspectives on what that spend might be, and how to use it, but not different in a bad way, but we just look at it differently. then emission factor, of course, and then the maturity. So, Oliver, you already said this, but strategic partnership and maturity of suppliers and relationship and also geography. I'll go through all of these, but the first top ones I'll go through a little bit more. So one click, please, and we look at the spend, because again, many suppliers, and this might be what your supply chain looks like, that you have quite few suppliers with a very high spend and a long tail of suppliers that are have very little spend or are barely used, but they're still there. They are in your supply chain and they are your suppliers. So if you look at those with a higher amount of spend, that usually relates to how much emissions you have with the suppliers. Not always, but usually it gives a very good indication. So you should probably start with those that has a little bit more spend in order to, if you want to reach your emissions. So that's one indication. And then you mix that with what you find on the next slide, and that is the emission factor. Emission factor, just saying that, is a little bit tricky. So what you should do, unless you have those emission factors in detail, is that you look at what sectors you're working with. What sectors do you have in your supply chain? And this is the example of from Ericsson again. Ericsson is a telecommunication equipment provider, meaning there's a lot of hardware. And so obviously we have a lot of hardware, high spend on hardware, also high emission on hardware, because that's a lot of metals in hardware. But we work, of course, with a lot of other categories as well. But if you have your spend and you have what categories that you're working with and the companies in those categories, you will answer a lot of your own questions of where to start when it comes to what suppliers to start with. Also thinking of that, you need to make it manageable with the ones that you have this dialogue with, back and forth, engagement, collaboration type of relationship. Engagement, maybe a little bit more. Collaboration, the tighter collaboration, that's going to be even fewer. And that can also be depending on the spend. Plus, if you find that you have a lot of emissions in one of the certain categories, then that would probably mark them for more collaborative approach. But not neglecting that suppliers that do not have high spend or high emissions are very, very important to work with. Because we have the starter uppers that are going to make sure that you reduce in your supply chain. And also you have the very interesting fact that we at Ericsson, we actually excluded for the first year when we started with 80 suppliers, we excluded consultancy services. But I think 6 months in, we brought them into the initiative because we realized that those are your biggest allies when it comes to finding good ways of working with reducing emissions. Because if you say to consultancy service and say that, oh, climate, yeah, that is very, very important for us. Whoop, they put it into their products in a second. They come with creative ideas to you and to their other customers. So it was brilliant to see the action that came out of having them on board in this activity. Also, they're pretty quick to set targets, usually because of their type of business. So I think if we have those two, and you look at your supplier base, your spend and your categories, a lot of questions will be solved. But in the next slide, I'll take you through quickly. Yes. Just here is one more slide on emission factors, and that's when you're buying materials. You know, it's easier to find emission factors for materials that is actually there in databases, average and sometimes also geographically separated into where you're buying things from. So it's different if you're buying materials, easier to find emission factors than if you're buying like chairs or some composite materials. It's not as easy to find. So then you probably will use your common sense or input from these emission factors. So there's a lot. If you Google around, you will learn a lot about this, also answering some of your questions. Now to the next slide. The 4 remaining factors apart from spend and emission factor. And again, majority of supplier climate work, if they have been working on environmental questions or sustainability or other similar questions, human rights, then it will be easier to have this dialogue with them, I'm sure. So you can think of that when you also select who to start with. Strategic partnership. That is also actually a way that you can start, because many companies, they have, these are our strategic suppliers based on importance, spend, or strategic value for other reasons. That could also be a great way of starting that. Let's make sure that we have them on board, because usually they are of great importance to others who ask, how are you faring with your strategic suppliers, customers and NGOs and financial institutions. They may ask about your strategic suppliers, which may come under another name in your company, but they are often under the light of compliance. How is compliance working for them? And climate should be a part of that kind of, well, yes, it's working well. Relationship with the supplier, if you have a good relationship, easier to talk to them about this. Geography is of great importance to keep in mind because of political reasons political standpoints in different parts of the world. The country may not have the same type of targets that you are aiming for, aligned with a 1.5 degree ambition and working towards 2050 or 2030. Also, the dialogue may not be on the table in some certain parts of the world. And also the availability of renewable energy and the maturity of getting hold of renewable energy, that will also raise some question marks with suppliers in those parts where it's not readily available, saying, okay, how will we handle this? And then it could be a little bit, take a little bit more of dialogue is one thing, but also a little bit more of effort to getting hold of renewable energy. So some companies have the approach of, let's start with the mature parts where we have renewable energy and the topic is on the table. Some companies do it that way. Other companies, they say, well, our approach is that we know it's harder in these parts of the world, therefore we're starting there now. So that depends on your company mentality and how you work. Yeah, all right. So I think I'm going to summarize now the fourth step here, and that's analysis. Just stepping into the analysis will answer a lot of your questions about how your world looks for your company and your sector. Also look at what is out there on the web, peers and partners, suppliers, customers, and also reports and tools. But also you can start with what you know. One of my go-to guys at the research department at Ericsson, he was also like, yeah, but company knows money. So you can start on how and where you spend your money, because if you don't know climate, at least you will get an indication, and you can start there. And if you're starting smaller like Ericsson, we started with 80 suppliers, and then we can adjust along the way, which we did. And now we're going towards 350 suppliers. So you start smaller and then you up the stakes all the time. Reasoning, that is a pretty, that I have not mentioned yet, but what I talked about is 6 different factors. You should keep in mind the reasoning you used for what suppliers you start with, because at some point someone will ask you, so why did you do that? And then you can say, well, we started with our strategic partners, or we started with the ones with our highest emissions. There are some companies that, of course, have this, well, like in Ericsson, we wanted to cover 90% of our emissions, and that meant approximately 350 suppliers, also giving us a big buffer so that we could cover 90% of emissions in the supply chain. If you don't have those numbers of 90% or 80% or whatever you may be reaching for, you may have another reasoning, like, well, we started with spend, or we started with this sector or something. So moving on. Oh, I'm talking so much, but it's because I had a few extra minutes, maybe. So you have done steps 1 to 4. You have your message, you have all the blessings that you need, and you have your suppliers. So communicate to suppliers. You have different tools to use there. It could be a simple email, it could be dialogue in a meeting, it could be, if you have a certain tool for supplier relationship. For Ericsson, we started off with emails. That's how we went for it. But then also we had a tool where we could do questionnaires and got all the answers into a database, which was very handy. So we've used several different approaches, also one-to-one, lots and lots of one-to-one meetings, which is necessary if you want to have this dialogue, collect questions and so on. So the step number 6 on the next slide, and that's the follow-up. And that's also, unfortunately, where some companies kind of hesitate and stop. It's the following up part, because you do the communication, you send out a message, you have a press release, you have the code of conduct, or maybe you send a mail to your suppliers, but you need to also follow up, otherwise little will happen. So I urge you to take a moment. That's also why I mentioned this manageable part. You can do communication to all, but if you want to have some qualitative work and also be able to capture the results of your activities and be able to report that out to what you have done, you need to follow up as well. And this 6-step approach, before we change slides here, I want to say that this is, of course, just one way of working. And I am not disrespecting or disregarding any other way, because we need to have different ways of working with this. But this is one very good and established and well-used way of working to ensure that your suppliers also have a target. Then you can work with certain suppliers with a very tight collaboration. You can work on renewable energy. You can make sure that they're all reporting to CDP, etc. But I think all these tie together to a very good mix. Some are experts in the CDP part, some are experts in having this setting the target part, and all those together will generate much better action. So on the next slide there, I will again promote SME Climate Hub, just like Oliver did. And the long tail of suppliers, they are not forgotten. We need to work with them too. They need to be on board. Out of the 334 million companies that we have in the world, most of them are SMEs. They need to be part of this. So this SME Climate Hub, which has evolved very much since the beginning, I'm really happy to say that we have for free. All of it is for free, so I don't have to say that again. But you can make a commitment as an SME. You can do calculations of your emissions. You can create reports of emissions. You can get support, and you can do education within this platform. So it's really brilliant, a brilliant tool. So make sure to promote that as well. And from Exponential Roadmap Initiative, we're also part there from the start with this tool. And we're severely promoting this because it's a great thing. Also, non-SMEs can look at it because you will find lots of great stuff there. But now I'm going to summarize quickly. So reuse what has been done. There's a lot of stuff out there. Find an approach, go for it, and use existing tools because there are plenty, and make sure you start. And if you don't have a deadline, I can give that for you. Why not make sure that you start, or that you have started before COP28 at the very latest, if you haven't started and gotten going, and if you haven't already have this sharp supplier engagement program. But those steps I talked about, the 1 to 6, that's a 2-month approach. You should be able to do that within 2 months. From getting management approval and blessing to maybe not the follow-up step, the sending out message step, then the suppliers, they may want a few weeks, maybe a month or 2 to actually get back to you. Yeah, so this is not a long-running thing. You should be able to do it really quickly. And now you can take the next slide, and I can stop it there. I would love some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liz. That was really useful. Great to see some really practical steps that I feel like put into practice straight away. One of the questions from the chat, I might start asking this to Oliver and then go back to you, Louise, is thinking a little bit about smaller companies who have less influence over their value chain. What's the recommendation, or what do you think that smaller companies should be thinking about, or what's the influence that they can do? Maybe Oliver, what's your view?
It's a great question, and it's always difficult to understand what you can possibly do. And a lot of this sounds very full of resource, full of time, full of effort, and I'm sure Louise has got some thoughts on this as well. Resources like the SME Climate Hub are a great resource. It is all laid out there, specially designed for companies that don't have resources, don't have capability, don't have money. Everything's for free and everything's as simple as it can. So even if you're engaging your suppliers with a sort of a request to go and check it out, a request to go and look at it, but it's not that difficult to start including contract clauses. It's not that difficult to start to simply ask suppliers if they've set a science-based target. Those sorts of questions, those sort of simple questions, can start to be included in just everyday conversations with both suppliers and customers. And actually, it's really interesting as a small supplier to maybe start asking your customers, your bigger customers, if they are doing work on this as well. It starts to open up new conversations. So it doesn't cost anything to start asking questions, or at least start talking about it. And so a lot of this can be very daunting, but simply adding a few questions into things you send to them or stuff you say to them is a great place to start. Louise, anything to add?
No, I just echoing what you said, and also I can give the example of Expansion Roadmap Initiative. We are a small company, and we have 29 suppliers, big and small, and we have also sent this message out. It doesn't matter if you're big or small. Maybe you can't influence, but it's also, if you as a small company come with this question, hey, don't you have a target? That's also, it can be quite an interesting dialogue you get out of that too. So you shouldn't shy away from just because you're a small supplier. Maybe a different result, but go for it.
I think that's great. And I really echo the idea. What are the small incremental things that you can do as a small business? And as Oliver said, adding things into your supply chain questionnaires, thinking about who are the suppliers that you want to do business with, and do you have options to go for companies that have set net zero targets and factor that into your procurement processes. Maybe just with the last 2 minutes, any thoughts or an overlay of how this model might change for an emerging market company?
This model, take that again.
Yeah. So just thinking about how does engagement, thinking about a company that's based in an emerging market, would they have a different approach, or have other considerations for scope 3? And I think I might start by saying that I think one of the challenges is it's a lot easier to talk about finding companies that have already set net zero targets and begin there. When you're in an emerging market, there are fewer companies that have set scope 3 targets, or let alone scope 3 targets with scope 1 or 2 targets. So one of the things that I think is really important with emerging markets is to really engage with your procurement process and think about the companies that you engage with. And then the messages that you send out to the companies that you're working with, and say, this is something that we're considering, and just have a conversation with people. And I think it might be a little bit less pointed, because they might not be used to receiving questionnaires like in other markets. Suppliers are used to getting asked these kinds of questions. But just having the dialogue, I think, is a really good way to engage. Any thoughts, Oliver, Louise, on emerging markets?
Sorry for not understanding, but so companies that are on the emerging market, meaning up and comers, growing companies.
Emerging market, I think that the question is probably more around sort of based in sort of maybe Africa.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The thought we had when we were working with these was to make sure that they get on board as soon as possible, having this dialogue, so that they kind of are on top of the topic. They may not have the same possibilities for working with this, but they should not kind of be left behind in any way. This is like SMEs may not have the same possibilities, but should get the same or more opportunities or support for getting on board.
Yeah, I think segmenting your suppliers about maturity and even things like language and geography is absolutely critical. You can't assume that every company in every place can do everything. I mean, certainly in certain places of the world, etc., and tools and solutions just aren't available flat out. So again, it's being very conscious of that. And again, that's where segmentation and planning your communications on a number of different metrics are critical.
Yeah, and I could sorry, and again, that some of the emerging markets that we were working with, they were also the most enthusiastic in this area, which was great to see.
Yeah, that's great. That's really encouraging to hear. Well, I think that brings us to time. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks ICI for organizing, and of course Oliver and Louise, thank you for joining and sharing some of your experience, what you see in the market. But thanks everyone. As we said, we'll send out the slides and a link to the recording. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.
Good luck everyone.
Thanks.
The support is out there.